All right, thanks Jay for giving your talk. So I guess I'll let you introduce yourself and say a few words about why you decided to share with us, and then we'll go from there.
My name is Jay, and I use he, him pronouns, and I'm an associate professor of higher education and student affairs at the University of Vermont. And my scholarship and my professional practice and my life is centered on the uplift and brilliance of trans and queer people, specifically in education. I feel a lot of solidarity with you all because I think education can be a site for liberation, and that's why I joined the Academy. And so I'm really excited for this conversation.
Go for it.
Awesome. Yeah. So Jay, I think coming from field stations, there's this interesting dynamic where sometimes there's a rough rap that there's risk for folks living on field station. There's clear data demonstrating that communities harassment can occur within the communities at field stations. But there's also really good evidence that the experience that people have at field stations can be transformative, and that experience can be especially impactful for people who may be underrepresented, that are coming into an environment and a community and having those experiences for the first time. And so when we talk about changing facilities, I think one of the big questions that occurs is how do you gain buy-in for making some of these changes and cultivating that community dynamic even more positively based on what you've talked about?
Great question. The beginning of your statement made me think about a couple of things. First, the potential of these field experiences for students. I mean, there's no better demonstration of a high impact educational practice than these. The cornerstone of high impact practice is a clear engagement with faculty and peers. And what better experience to have an academic socialization, but also just a personal socialization in a really intimate setting. A lot of what I do is from an ecological perspective, and everything is nested within one another. To have a conversation about buy-in or facilities requires more than just talking about the blueprints of a building or the mechanics of a records keeping process. What I mean by an ecological perspective is state policies are nested in institutional policies and cultures, which are nested within an academic discipline and the campus climate within that subdiscipline. And then as each area gets closer to who we are, it has stronger influence. So of course, the strongest influence is peer socialization and faculty-staff relationships. So when we're talking about these, of course, we want to highlight how we can have buy-in for policies, but broadly, it's also about how to have buy-in about creating an equitable learning environment for everybody. Oftentimes when we talk about marginalization in higher ed, we focus on the people who are marginalized, which is important and valid. We want to uplift those voices and center those experiences when we're making decisions. With that being said, genderism affects all of us. Restrictive binaries of gender has an impact on every one of our lives, whether it's directly through how we experience it, whether it's through our gender identities or expressions and how people perceive them, or whether it's just the cultural ethos of a place. It's really critical that we understand that we should all have a shared investment in intersectional justice, and we shouldn't have to convince people of the worth and dignity of trans and non-binary people to make these decisions. It should be a conversation about respect, inherent worth, and value. That's where I would start. To be politically savvy, I would also, on the side, create a critical mass of people who were intersectional justice educators, who also share the joys and benefits of gender, racial, sexual ability, national origin uplift, and celebrating that as our communities become more diverse, it only strengthens the academic potential of our work.
So to follow up on that, thinking about So if we say we get buy-in, and then we're thinking about how to prepare our facilities to be more inclusive, part of what has come up is that, many of our facilities, students are coming to us and members of our community are coming to us, and they're starting to be more willing to be open with their identities, and we want to accommodate them, but often we're still just starting to figure out how to do that and what that looks like. And so part of the interest in many stations in doing this is how do we welcome these people, and how do we change our systems so that everybody is included. And so I was particularly interested in thinking about that in your talk. You mentioned rather than having the other option, having a not listed, please specify option. But the carry on to that is I was wondering if you could provide guidance for our station staff who are then in charge of triaging those not listed, please specify. How do we help our staff become more informed and feel confident in navigating that kind of information to make sure that they're making choices in things like where they place people in housing that keeps everybody included?
I'm going to bounce it back to you all. I'm so curious, in your field stations, what education and training is available to staff, particularly in reservations, or faculty mentors or students, about genderism and inclusion or anti-racism in these facilities?
I would say at ours, nothing formal. I think like most universities, you can voluntarily seek out safe space training, that sort of thing, but it's definitely not something we require of our staff.
Clemson, we're required to take training, but it's online.
Yeah, I kind of want to add to Cora's question too about for staff, a lot of the contact time that we have with these students is pretty brief as staff, but we are the ones welcoming them to our place and setting the tone. And if you have advice on how to do that, no training on any of this stuff except for the terrible online videos at best.
That sounds tough. We've all sat through those videos. I'm thinking about a few things. There are passive ways of signaling inclusion, like the language that we use, introducing our pronouns in a space, avoiding gendered language like, what are you guys doing later? And saying, what are you all doing later, for example, are small things. Or changing the marketing campaign of your materials so that your website and promotional materials reflect the beautiful diversity of your cohort of students and other visitors who come to your space. Regarding training, my immediate go-to would be queer and trans resource centers on your campus. And if you're unsure of where that is located, there's a great organization called the Consortium of LGBT Resource Professionals in Higher Education. And they have a really robust clearinghouse of resources for people just like yourselves who are within their academic disciplines want to provide a more gender affirming space. Another great resource is called the Trans Policy Clearing Resource House. That is curated by Dr. Ginny Beeman. Dr. Ginny Beeman is the director of the LGBTQ Center at UMass Amherst, and it provides an exhaustive list of every gender inclusive policy at every university in the United States, including all gender housing, including restrooms and athletic facilities, which I think will be quite relevant to you all, including non-discrimination policies. And there's direct resources on how to phrase your policies based on some really exemplar models already out there in higher ed. Cora, I feel like I went off the rails and I missed the essence of your question.
Well, I mean, that was, I think essentially, I was asking how do we empower our staff to know how to respond inclusively to non-binary folks, and training. It sounds like reaching out to those resource centers is a good first step. Gretchen, did you have something to add?
I did have something to add to that. I think you hit the mark right on the head, Jay. We recently revised our housing form a reservation request. And in doing so, a number of the staff and administrators sat down with people from our diversity and inclusion office at UW-Madison, and they joined us in actually like working towards revision of that. It's an online form. But in that process, the person that came in presented quite a bit of information overlapping with your talk. And I think that the staff that was in that meeting, it was a lot more impactful than the online training, because we were shooting for an objective. We were really working together with this, person who had great knowledge to implement a change. And so I really enjoyed that type of training. It was functional, operational. So I think you really hit it on the head, at least in that experience. It was really positive for the staff in training.
That's so great to hear. As a former queer and trans student services professional, it always warms my heart when people reach out to those units. I mean, what a valuable resource if you have one on your campus. With those trainings, or even in informal conversations, there's just some really great affirming ways to support people in their education. First, sharing our stories and our gendered histories might help create a relationship with why genderism has such a detrimental impact on a lot of our experiences in education and beyond. And also, as a former staff member, I would imagine that the people who are doing these reservations and helping are just really wonderful people who are great educators who want to promote inclusion. And so I feel like offering educational opportunities in community with each other, just as you mentioned, Gretchen, what a wonderful opportunity to offer further education for staff as well. For parents of students or partners of staff or faculty or other stakeholders who may be interested in understanding how facilities operate, I would keep it minimal, if I'm being honest, to a brief Q&A. I don't require buy-in from those people to promote an equitable learning environment. Now, a learning experience would be facilitated if I had them as partners in the educational journey. But in everything I do, I always want to center people who are most impacted, who are most affected. And so if I have to reach a decision where I don't have buy-in from some stakeholders, but trans and non-binary people feel heard and represented, that'd probably be an educational risk that I'd be willing to make.
Yeah, I really appreciate that that perspective from your talk, that that the default would be inclusion, and if people wanted accommodation outside of that, that they would that would have to be the other request. Like I'm not comfortable with that. Okay, then you go over here. I think that was a really helpful way to think about how we can take our existing structures and limited resources and make them more inclusive just straight away.
Imagine a world where the form says we're an all gender facility and we do not separate by gender. If you feel uncomfortable with this, please click below for more information. You provide a justification for why you do that. And then you say, if you're so uncomfortable, please provide your preferred accommodations and we'll do the best we can to meet those needs. And then for people who don't indicate that they have a problem or difficulty with that, you don't have to collect any demographic information. And the reason I'm saying that is there's a vulnerability and a risk to disclosing transness and queerness. And so people may not feel comfortable or affirm doing that. Instead of forcing them into doing that, why don't we just change the environment around us so that we can circumvent that altogether? And
yeah,
I'm really aware that it's, oh, you go ahead and go for it.
I wanted to add, when we had this conversation, myself and Allison Matthias, she walked the facilities with me recently, and she kind of audited what we're doing here at my field station. And we talked a bit about how putting in a special request for a special accommodation would also accommodate people with different medical needs that we've encountered, and that way you don't need to know what condition anybody has. You just say, do you need your own separate space, or and then we don't want to know why. Just if you need it, let us know.
That's such a great point. And I hear myself talking, and I'm rooted in a deep philosophical belief, but I don't work in field stations. So a lot of people listening right now might be like, okay, well, if someone indicates they're not comfortable in this setup, we only have one room or we only have 2 rooms. What do we do then? And it's a difficult logistical process. And if I may offer, embrace empathy and patience, and listen to your community. I don't think any of these decisions have to be made in isolation. So even though academia is hierarchical and we're often tasked with the organizational management of these facilities, just try to embrace as much community buy-in as possible. And of course, again and again, center people who are most impacted by binary notions of gender and sex and genderism altogether.
All right, so we're at our 15 minutes, and I wanted to thank Jay for sharing his thoughts.